Okay, welcome back from lunch, everyone. It's 1:30, so we're going to go ahead and kick off our afternoon portion of the agenda. But before we do, just a couple quick thoughts. The first is that I heard from Wes. Wes will not be joining us this week. He's attending to some family matters and is going to be spending time with his family. So if you guys can keep him in your thoughts this week, that would be great. So I'll be chairing the remainder of the meeting. The second thing that I wanted to address was more for the folks who are participating online. As chair and having done this now for a number of years, it can sometimes be difficult to monitor and navigate not only the people in the room, but also everyone online. And it was an oversight earlier. I missed a member of the public that wanted to speak and address Dr. Moore's executive director's report. So we're going to go back to that, and I'll take that. But I just want folks online to understand that it is challenging at times when there's a lot happening, just to see all the different moving parts that are happening around, not only in the room, but in all places on the planet as well. So I apologize for that. So before we get started on the next item on the agenda, I want to go back, and James Fletcher had his hand up before the break that I failed to see. So James, if you're with us, if you have any comments or questions regarding the executive director's report, I'll go ahead and turn to you.
I had a couple of questions. One, when Dr. Moore addressed the dogfish aging, I wanted to ask the question, rather than spending the money and the time trying to age the dogfish, why could not that same energy be addressed towards a male dogfish fishery separate from the normal dogfish plan? In other words, for the last 7 to 10 years, the United National Fishermen's Association has been trying to get a male fishery. And it gets kicked down the can, down the road unintentionally, because we never have time. There probably now won't be a group that will fish for them. But it's a shame that we missed the opportunity of a group of people that were willing to fish for them. That's number one. Number two is on the tilefish, the blue line tilefish. When we started the fishery permits for the commercial fishermen, we said everybody had to have a federal permit. If you didn't, you got a NOVA. On the recreational dogfish, NOVA is notice of violation. On the recreational dogfish, the recreational blue line tile, I can't find that anybody has been given a NOVA for not having a permit. And we've been in this, I think, a year or more. The commercials did not get that opportunity. So the question is, for the council, when are you going to require law enforcement to write a NOVA to a vessel that has a blue line tilefish on it and does not have a permit? But it's frustrating. You think you have, and Mr. Chair, I apologize, but you think you have problems with the new technology and stuff. Think about somebody that's 78 years old trying to learn and keep up with what they know in fisheries management. We have to get fisheries management where we're producing fish and not stopping the fishermen. And I thank you for your time, and I especially thank you for reviewing this. Thank you, James Fletcher.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for your comments. I'm going to ask if Chris, are there anyone have any response to those questions? Chris?
Yeah, thank you, Jim, for the comments in terms of let's deal with the the tilefish thing first. In terms of tilefish, golden tilefish, blue line tilefish, Council has expressed concern relative to the enforcement of those regulations that relate to recreational permitting and reporting. We continue to track it. We continue to have interactions with the appropriate law enforcement folks. It's it's not as high a priority as some of the other things that they're dealing with. We understand that, and that's why we've taken on this new initiative to start looking at other ways to maybe increase compliance through outreach and some other methods. So hopefully that's going to work. And certainly we're not forgetting about the enforcement stuff, and you'll continue to hear more about it over the upcoming year. So that's tilefish. Relative to spiny dogfish, we think that the investment in the workshop was a well-spent investment, that we had good attendance. It's important for that spiny dogfish assessment that everyone on the same page as it relates to aging of spiny dogfish. And apparently they're not. So we have this workshop. We had folks that came to the workshop from Norway and the West Coast and other places around the world. And it's my understanding, I didn't go to the workshop, but it's my understanding that it went well. It had nothing to do with your other issue, which is the male-only fishery for spiny dogfish. But based on my conversations with Jason, we haven't forgotten about that. And there are folks that continue to think about it at the center and other places. So it's not like we're not investing in that as well. We continue to work on it. So we'll see where that takes us. And I think that's it. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Chris. And I may ask NOAA's Office of Enforcement and the Coast Guard if we're going to get into your reports and maybe give some thought to the tilefish issue if it's come up, or whether or not you want to address that for Mr. Fletcher and the rest of us when we get to that. So moving on, we're going to jump into the organizational reports. We're going to start with the regional office. Mike Petney is going to provide that report. It's all you, Mike.
Thanks, Mr. Vice Chair. So starting off with Habitat Area of Particular Concern designation recommended by the New England Council. We published a final rule yesterday, February 5th, to implement that new habitat area of particular concern offshore of southern New England. And this is intended to focus our essential fish habitat conservation recommendations on areas that are important for cod spawning activity, as well as other complex benthic habitats that serve important habitat functions for a number of council-managed fishery species. The rule is effective March 6th, 2024, but we are already utilizing that designation in our EFH consultations and conservation recommendations. On January 2nd, we published the final catch specifications for the 2024 and 2025 bluefish fishery, consistent with the recommendations of this council. And that final rule was effective on January 1st. On December 21st, we published the final rule approving the 2024 specifications for summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass, as well as the projected 2025 specifications for summer flounder and scup, all consistent with the recommendations of the council and the board. The specifications establish the allowable harvest levels for those three species. And the rule also removed the January 1 through April 30th federal recreational scup closure. So that area is reopened as of January 1st for scup recreational fishing. This doesn't really affect this council too much, but just for consistency, on September 29th, we filed, this is a reminder, we filed an interim final rule that implements mandatory harvester reporting requirements for the American lobster fishery. This is the last kind of commercial fishery that did not have electronic vessel trip report requirements. So those will be effective on April 1st, and we're assisting the fishing industry with that transition. But once that's implemented, then all of our commercial and all of our for-hire fisheries will be reporting electronically. Let's see, some groundfish issues, probably not that interesting because it's Gulf of Maine. On January 25th, we published a temporary rule implementing a 2,000-pound herring possession limit for midwater trawl vessels fishing in the Cape Cod catch cap closure area. And this is the catch cap is the river herring and shad catch cap that applies in the Cape Cod area. So the herring regulations require that we implement this possession limit once we project that river herring and shad catch is projected to reach 95% of the catch cap that applies in that area. And so that will actually be in effect for the remainder of the calendar year through December 31st. Under our bycatch reduction engineering program, our headquarters Office of Sustainable Fisheries received 78 pre-proposals for the 2024 bycatch reduction engineering program grant process. We are currently reviewing the pre-proposals for relevance and their application to our priorities. Those applicants that have the top ranked pre-proposals will be encouraged to submit full proposals, which will be due on March 20th. And people will be competing for roughly $2.3 million to support those projects. On January 31st, we published a 60-day notice for the extension of Paperwork Reduction Act requirements regarding the Northeast Region Observer Providers requirements. So interested persons are invited to submit written comments. I can get the email address if people are interested. For reference, there's a control number that people should include in their comments. Comments will be accepted through April 1st. So if anybody is interested in commenting on that, please let me know. We'll get you the detailed information. And that's all I have. But happy to take any questions.
Okay, Mike, thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Mike? Okay, seeing none in the room. Anyone online? Okay, seeing none. You're off the hook, Mike. Thank you. Okay, next I'm going to jump to the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, Dr. John Hare.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. We have updates for you all today. First, on the budget, we're on a continuing resolution until surveys. Those have been funded completely, partially funded through Northeast Fisheries Science Center funds, partially funded through a congressional addition to our funding. Without a full year budget, we're not sure what the language is around those two surveys. So we're still in a bit of a waiting game. Continuing resolution goes through early March. In terms of our surveys, Science Center did release a sources sought announcement for vessels interested in being chartered for the Northeast Fisheries Science Center Sea Scallop Dredge Survey. And we've also looking for vessels that could tow the HABCAM. This is working along the intent of potentially moving the Sea Scallop survey to industry-based vessel. In terms of the Northeast Trawl Advisory Panel, we'll be getting an update later today. They are meeting on Thursday to go through some of their business. We delivered the white paper to the New England Fisheries Management Council, and there'll be a discussion here tomorrow. Dr. Catherine Ford will be presenting the white paper. I think the interactions working with NTAP on this issue have been very productive. Encouraged to see where the idea of an industry-based trawl survey goes. There was a large increase in the number of sea days allocated to the Mid-Atlantic small mesh otter trawl fleet compared to the previous 3 years. I believe the Observer program has been sort of talking through that with representatives of the fishing industry. And if there are questions, last week at the New England Council meeting, KB McCardle, who's our new division director of that division, gave a very thorough presentation on the Observer program. I think she's scheduled to give a similar presentation here at a future meeting. In terms of assessment updates, we're looking to hold all the peer review meetings hybrid. So we'd have both sort of in-person and virtual opportunities. The research track steering committee is planning to hold its first meeting virtually in April 24th to 26th, and there'll be more details on that soon. In terms of the 2023-2027 stock assessment schedule, Dr. Moore indicated that it is available on the NRCC webpage and sort of showed the schedule for Mid-Atlantic stocks in his report. We've got the research track meetings coming up. The Winter Flounder Research Track is scheduled for January 2024, their first meeting. And the Longfin Squid Research Track, their first meeting was January 29th, 2024. So we're making progress getting started on those two research tracks. And then we have the Applying State Space Model, which is finishing. Atlantic Cod, which is finished. We've got the Golden Tilefish, which is ongoing. Sea Scallops, which is ongoing. Yellowtail Flounder, which is ongoing. And Atlantic Herring, which is ongoing. We also had the Black Sea Bass assessment, which passed peer reviewed. I know Dr. Alati or Dr. Kirsten Purdy will be here to give a presentation on that assessment at this meeting today, or meeting this week. In terms of cooperative research, they hosted the Northeast Cooperative Research Summit in Cape May on February 5th, which I believe was yesterday. Over 170 scientists, fishing industry members, and stakeholders registered with broad participation from those of you I've talked to here. It was an excellent meeting with a really exciting exchange of ideas. And I think it just demonstrates the commitment that the Northeast Fisheries Science Center and the Greater Atlantic Regional Fisheries Office has to cooperative research and collaborative research. One exciting that the cooperative research program is developing is this pilot hook and line survey. This survey is modeled after a recreationally based hook and line survey on the West Coast, and we'll be piloting this year using 3 vessels as platforms. That's the FV Lady Rebecca in the Gulf of Maine, the FV Francis in southern New England, and the FV Rudy Waller in the Mid-Atlantic. And the intent is to just try out a number of different fishing methods, evaluate the idea as a pilot. It's not going to be used in stock assessment. But if we are successful, we see hook and line as one possible survey method that will carry us into an era with fixed and floating wind turbines. Not going to cover all the species that we have responsibilities for assessments, but it is successful on the West Coast, and we want to see if we think it could be successful here. So that work will be ongoing this year, and be happy to report on how it goes in the fall or spring, next fall of this year, spring of the following year. In terms of our ecosystem dynamics and assessment group, they are working on the state of the ecosystem report for the Mid-Atlantic Council. That will be presented at an upcoming meeting. And they also continue to develop the ecosystem and socioeconomic profile, and including the information from those profiles in research track assessment. And they're currently, they worked with the Black Sea Bass assessment and the Bluefish assessment previously, and they're currently working with the fish assessment now. So again, working to bring in socioeconomic information and broader ecosystem information into the research track assessment process, into the research track assessment consideration. We have developed the Northeast Climate Decision Support Team that's part of the Climate Ecosystem Fisheries Initiative. It's being led by Dr. Vince Saba, who's a Northeast Fisheries Science Center employee, but who sits at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory. We've identified, a couple of applications where that information would be useful. Black sea bass is an example. You'll hear more tomorrow or the next day about how black sea bass now has a temperature-dependent recruitment function. So you use temperature to understand recruitment in the past, but you can also use projected temperature from a climate model to model the population in the future. So that's one direct application that we see for this Climate Ecosystem Fisheries Initiative. decision support team. And there are others, yellowtail flounder, in a similar situation, research track ongoing now, potential for a temperature dependent recruitment function. If that plays out in that research track process, it gives us the opportunity to project recruitment using climate models into the future. So an exciting development for the region and supportive of the climate scenario planning effort. In terms of protected species, there's obviously been a lot going on with protected species. It's right whale calving season. I believe by last count, there are 17 calves born. 2 have gone missing, presumed dead, and a third has been struck by a vessel, but it's still being cited with the mother. But it's a serious injury, so not sure that that calf is going to survive. So there's, good news, 17 calves, and disappointing news, likely 2 or 3 have perished already. But we continue to really be committed to stopping the decline in North Atlantic right whales and promoting the recovery. Dr. Moore mentioned the offshore wind North Atlantic right whale strategy, which was just completed last week. The intent there is to develop offshore wind while protecting and conserving and promoting the recovery of North Atlantic right whales. So how are NOAA Fisheries and Bureau of Ocean Energy Management going to do that together? There's a number of priorities that are identified in that strategy that we'll be working on together, and involving many partners to be successful in both of those endeavors. In terms of on-demand, the ropeless development of ropeless technology continues. Northeast Fisheries Science Center has their gear library. There are also conversations in the South Atlantic for their black sea bass fishery to trial ropeless. Just a lot of progress being made in that technology. The New England Council has their gear conflict working group. That is one of the major barriers, is how do other fishers know where ropeless gear is? How do you communicate that information? Currently, it's communicated with a buoy on the surface. You take the buoy off the surface, it's hard to know where the gear is. So how do we work through that? And working with the New England Council on that gear conflict working group. In terms of our offshore wind updates, again, we continue to work closely with the regional office, supporting their regulatory actions, working with Office of Protected Resources, supporting their regulatory action. We understand that the final wind energy areas to be leased in the Gulf of Maine will be determined later this spring, with a likely lease time in the fall. So that will define the leased areas in the Gulf of Maine. That information will be very important to all of us from a science perspective, from a management perspective, and from a fisheries perspective. We are currently working with Ørsted on their Revolution wind development. The record of decision had a requirement for mitigating NOAA fisheries surveys. And so we're working through with Ørsted and what exactly does that mitigation look like. That's an active conversation and it has been quite productive to date. So a lot going on with offshore wind. And I think I'll stop there, Mr. Chair, and happy to take any questions.
All right, thanks, John. While I look around for questions, so Chris and I were just wondering, so 17 calves, is that typical? Is it above average on a given year for the right whale?
Well, like macro recruitment, average depends on the time period that you're looking at. So if you look at the long time period of all calving data, it's probably still a little bit on the low end. If you look at over the past 5 to 10 years, it's on the high end. So it's a positive sign that there are 17 calves were born, but it's probably the long term, just below the long term. More than zero.
Thank you. Any other questions for John? Anyone online? Anyone in the audience? Okay, seeing none. John, thanks for the report. Appreciate it.
You're welcome, Mr. Chair. This is 2 meetings. In New England, I didn't get any questions either, so I don't know what that says about my presentation, but I'll take it as a good sign.
It's right after lunch too, so
Maybe that's what
typically.
it is.
Actually, here we're gonna break it here. We got.
Yeah, we touched on it, I think, real quickly. There's a review that you are organizing with folks from the 2 SSCs to help you with the surveys, right?
Correct.
So can you tell us about that a little bit?
Yes. So as part of our offshore wind survey mitigation strategy, we committed to developing survey-specific mitigation plans for each one of our 14 surveys. So what does that mean? Our bottom trawl survey is likely not going to be able to operate in. What are we going to do? We're developing a survey-specific mitigation plan for our bottom trawl survey to lay out the steps that we're going to take to continue collecting the data that's needed for assessments, but figuring out how to do so in an ocean that has wind energy areas. So we've been talking with Dr. Chris Moore and Dr. Kate O'Keefe about having a small group, some Mid-Atlantic Council SSC representation, some New England Council SSC representation, some experts from Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission to review our first draft of the survey mitigation plans for our fisheries-esque survey. So it's bottom trawl survey, sea scallop survey, clam survey. I think our ecosystem monitoring survey is in there. We're going to ask for review on the pilot hook and line survey. We don't have the survey yet, but what advice can you give us to improve these plans? So that's something that we're looking to set up this spring. And then we'll do something similar for our protected species surveys, but we wouldn't be working with the councils, SSCs, and the Fishery Commission for those. Thank you. Thank you for the question, Chris.
All right, thank you. Okay, next we're going to go to the always exciting NOAA Office of General Counsel report. We're going to juice it up here. Get things going a little bit. John Almeida.
Post-lunch excitement. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since our last meeting, some exciting news from the world of GC. NIMS went to the Supreme Court. You may recall the Loper Bright case and the Relentless case. These were 2 different lawsuits challenging the New England Council's industry-funded amendment. Loper Bright was brought in the District of Columbia. Relentless was brought in the District of Rhode Island. They both wound their way through the courts of appeals and landed in the Supreme Court. Oral argument happened on January 17th. So at this point, we're waiting for the court's decision. For those who listened in on the argument, you might have noticed that there was very little discussion of magnet, and that was how the court wanted it. The question that they certified for review was not about Magnuson, but it was focused on what they should do with regard to something called Chevron deference. And you might have heard, this was a big days of when the hearing happened. This was all over the papers and the news. Chevron deference is a Supreme Court created legal tool by which courts are instructed in some circumstances to defer to an agency's interpretation of a statute that's the agency's responsibility to implement. So for NIMS, Magnuson, right? The context for the court to take this up was in, the Loper Bright and Relentless cases that were about industry-funded monitoring. In those cases, the plaintiffs were taking issue with Chevron in the lower court's analysis. So we're waiting for the Supreme Court to issue a decision, and based on the lively discussion among the justices during that argument, I imagine that working out that decision is going to be an interesting undertaking in the Supreme Court chambers. So, typically you get a decision by the fall. So that's kind of the time frame we're looking at on a decision from the Supreme Court. Also, since our last meeting, there was a new case filed the District of New Hampshire relating to the American lobster fishery and the Commission's cap agencies regulations relating to that trap cap in Lobster Management Area 3. This case has just begun, so the agency hasn't filed anything in the case yet. The case in the District of Columbia, the NRDC case that's challenging the Mid-Atlantic's recreational harvest control rule framework, we're in the middle of briefing that case. We will be fully briefed February 16th. And then at that point, we'll see if the court wants to have oral argument or if the court is just going to decide on the papers. Right whale litigation, kind of the two last cases relating to fisheries, the Maine Lobstermen's Association case, you may recall that case is done on the merits. At this point, all that's left is the plaintiffs have filed a petition for attorney's fees. And so figuring out, whether fees will be paid or not, that's all that's left in the Maine Lobstermen's Association case. In the CBD CLF case, you may recall that's the companion case to the MLA case relating to the 2021 Fisheries Biological Opinion and one take reduction plan amendment. You may recall that I've reported in the past that NIMS had filed a motion to dismiss the case in light of the provisions in the 2023 Consolidated Appropriations Act relating to right whales and the lobster fishery, and the DC Circuit's ruling in that MLA case, Maine Lobstermen's Association case. Last week, Judge Boasberg granted the motion to dismiss and vacated a few of his earlier orders in the case in light of this dismissal, in light of the provisions of the Consolidated Appropriations Act. So his 2022 summary judgment decision and the associated decision on remedy have been vacated in that case. If none of the parties seek additional review of that dismissal order, that should represent the end of the substantive litigation in that case. And that's a case that goes back 6 years. 6 years. So coming to its end. And that's all I have in my report. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Okay, thank you. Is that a new tie that you got there for the Supreme Court?
I didn't splurge on a new suit like you suggested.
Questions for John? Seeing none in the room, anyone online? Any questions for John? Seeing none at this time. Appreciate your report, John. Thank you. Okay, next, we're going to go to NOAA's Office of Law Enforcement. Caleb Gilbert is with us. Caleb, whenever you're ready.
I'm here, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Good to be here today. Be a tough follow, but I'll do my best, John. Start by saying my wife sends her condolences that she can't be here today. She wishes she could, but as a marital couple with children of a certain age, you get one or the other of us. So our sincere apologies for that. North Atlantic right whale conservation and observer program support continued to be our top two priorities for Office of Law Enforcement in the Northeast Division. Surprise, surprise. I'll provide a couple updates on our work related to those priorities, but first I have some end of year FY23 statistics that I'd like to share today with the council. So from October 1st, 2022 through September 30th, 2023, we opened 708 incidents, and I'll provide some context on that stat in a moment. We share the details of those incidents in the written quarterly reports we provided to the council over the last year. In addition, in total in FY23, we conducted 251 patrols. Of those, 107 were at sea, 98 were land-based patrols, and 11 were at sea. I think I just made a typo. 11 were in the air, I should say. The remainder involved container shipment inspections, patrols at airports, seaports, and border crossings between the U.S. and Canada. We issued 84 summary settlements in FY23 for a total assessed value of over $85,000. Again, the details of those summary settlements were provided in our quarterly reports to the council. We also issued 26 written warnings and assessed penalties on 60 novas for a total value of over $1.1 million. For reference, all of those metrics, except for the novas issued, are down from the previous year. And the number of novas we assessed penalties for doubled from FY23 to 22 to 23. Novas are highly labor intensive, so it makes sense that if nova metrics increase, we would drop in other categories. Fluctuations in all those metrics up and down from year to year is normal for us. And our increase in nova production is in response to our prioritization of efforts to process North Atlantic right whale speed rule cases. So back to our priority focused enforcement efforts and continuing with North Atlantic right whale conservation, our efforts continue to be split between Atlantic large whale take reduction plan and speed rule enforcement. So starting on the take reduction plan side, we don't yet have our Q1 FY24 take reduction plan patrol stats yet available. Those should be ready to share with the council at the April meeting. We're also in the early stages of planning next summer's Lobster Management Area 3 ROV patrols. As in previous years, those patrols would focus on take reduction plan requirements. But on the ropeless side of take reduction plan enforcement, I mentioned the enforcement gear walk workshop we conducted last October at the last council meeting. There's talk of hosting similar workshops with interested JA partners in coming months. One of our EOs joined a center-led training involving ropeless fishing with Mass Environmental Police and their Division of Marine Fisheries staff last week. And I'll be sure to keep the council posted on any new developments in that regard. A training is also scheduled for federal enforcement at the end of the month on the Earth navigating and accessing the Earth Ranger cloud-based app. It's what we can use to see fixed gear positions at sea currently under the experimental fishery. Ropeless take reduction team related training interest with state partners in the Mid-Atlantic may increase in 2025. And just to add that in there, when take reduction plan amendments are anticipated that may affect gillnet and non-lobster trap pot fishermen. Regarding speed enforcement, since the December meeting, we conducted a couple more speed enforcement operations. The most recent was conducted last week, covering vessel traffic out of Charleston, South Carolina, and the mouth of Delaware Bay. 23 vessels were checked for speed during those events. Also, since the last council meeting, our case processing numbers on speed enforcement continue to tick up. We're now up to over $1,115,000 in civil penalties across 65 cases processed since 2022. Also of note, of the 18 cases processed so far for the 22-23 seasonal management area season, 17 of those are for recreational pleasure craft. For reference, in the 21-22 SMA season, only a little over half of our speed rule novas were assessed for penalties by that vessels in that category, the recreational pleasure vessels. Right whales have been spotted recently in the Gulf of Maine and the south of Nantucket, as well as off Cape May and Chincoteague, if I pronounced that correctly. Our investigative support staff continue our efforts to set up geofences around observed North Atlantic right whale sightings and alert vessels of whale presence by VMS who enter those geofences for up to 48 hours. In the Gulf of Maine, we ended up sending 8 messages to 5 different vessels and 34 messages to vessels entering the geofences in the other areas where the whales were spotted. And moving on to our observer priority. Our observer liaison special agent provided enforcement trainings to 2 new training classes of observers and participated in the accompanying at-sea safety panel discussions in those trainings in the Q1 FY24. While we weren't able to coordinate an observer roundtable meeting in the Mid-Atlantic last quarter, we were able to conduct an event this morning here downstairs. A number of us attended, including some folks that are still in the room with us today. I think we had a fairly lively discussion covering topics like observer-related case processing and safety violations. A few of us from law enforcement were there, including Lieutenant Commander Cayley joined us, myself, our D2 Senior Enforcement Officer, Roy Fisher, and one of our special agents attended as well. So I thought it was a productive meeting. And by the way, these meetings are not public. Outside of our two core priorities, I'll start by covering a little bit about SIMP. We're continually allocating resources to SIMP. That's our Seafood Import Monitoring Program. So far this year, enforcement officers participated in a couple of joint planning inspections in Michigan, one in the Detroit Metro Airport and the other in the Port Huron, Michigan Port of Entry. Other SIMP-focused inspections we plan each year on the East Coast are still in the works, and EOs here continue their regular inspections at ports such as at Boston and Newark, usually in close communication with our partners at U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. It's probably a good time to remind the fishing community to submit valid and accurate information on permit applications. We do look at falsely submitted information. For instance, an enforcement officer was recently informed by general counsel that a $5,000 NOVA was assessed to the owner of a Maine-based boat dealership for knowingly submitting inaccurate information on HMS permit applications. Thought I'd throw that in there today. And blue line tilefish enforcement came up earlier. Just to cover that briefly, I reported out on our related enforcement efforts in the past. That enforcement continues. We do rely heavily on referrals from our JEA enforcement partners in the Mid-Atlantic for that related case processing. For reference, I'm looking up our case processing before every meeting now. So anytime something new pops up that's publicly available for a closed case that I can share, I'm going to do that. But I did that for this meeting, and nothing new popped up. But that doesn't mean we're not still working on blue line tilefish recreational enforcement. We are. I hope that's at least slightly satisfying for some folks. The last topic I have today to share with council relates to leadership personnel changes in OLE. Our longtime Office of Law Enforcement Director, James Landon, left us last month to work for the Federal Aviation Administration. There are a whole series of cascading acting positions currently in place while we transition leadership roles at the headquarters level. I'm happy to provide more detail if folks are interested, but I think the important point is that the Office of Law Enforcement is well equipped to handle leadership transitions at all levels. And on that note, I'm pleased to report that Mike Henry has been selected as our NED Assistant Director. He's been meeting the challenge of serving in that role in an acting capacity since June of 2022. So we're delighted that he'll continue to lead our group. That's all I have to report today, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks, Caleb. Any questions? Michelle Duval?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And Caleb, this may not be really a specific question for Office of Law Enforcement. It might be more of an all of NOAA question, but I'm just curious, like where the vessel speed rule stands with respect to North Atlantic right whales. If, you know, any of the NOAA mothership folks here have any information on the status of that, or, you know, seeing heads shake, but thought I would ask it. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have anything to add. I'm sure someone does far above our heads, but that person is not me.
Just thought I would ask. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michelle. Any other questions? Chris Moore?
Caleb, thanks for the report. You said something about Earth Ranger?
Yes.
Yeah, what is that?
So let's see if I can recall details. It's a Paul Allen Institute derived AI platform that was adopted for utilization in developing our ropeless fishery. Maybe the best way to describe it. So basically it's designed to capture data from multiple sources and store it in a cloud that can be accessible to via internet. So taking data from, you know, in the case of ropeless fishing, different manufacturers collecting positions, GPS, you know, maybe acoustically derived bottom positions, sending it to the cloud storing that data, and then redistributing that data potentially to different users.
Okay, any other questions? I have James Fletcher. Go ahead, James.
The wind boats that are foreign flagged, how do they come underneath NOAA's whale rulings? And also the foreign shippers, the container ships that are foreign flagged, if they are outside 12 miles, what rules allow NOAA to enforce a penalty? In other words, if the vessel is foreign flagged and has not entered into U.S. waters or has left U.S. waters, how does NOAA get what rules allow NOAA authority on those vessels?
Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. I'd have to check my notes, but I do believe we've assessed NOVAs for foreign flagged vessels that violated speed rule restrictions inside our SMAs. Those have been assessed. I can't speak to the fully adjudicated side of it, but you might be able to find that information on our general counsel's website. I haven't looked at it recently, but that type of information may be available. But in supplemental to AIS, we are regularly on the water, boots on the ground, speed enforcement patrol, as I mentioned in my report. To date, I don't think they've been terribly fruitful in identifying actual violations, but that doesn't mean we're going to stop doing them. That's a priority of ours. I think we firmly feel that that's making a difference. Seeing the folks that are out there, seeing our enforcement patrol boats, and maybe they're responding and getting compliant before we have time to catch them in a violation. But we will continue to pursue both avenues of enforcement and speed enforcement. So with AIS and patrols.
Okay. So Caleb, I had a wise ass comment I was going to make about you being here versus your wife, but I realized that she's listening. So I've learned from my mistakes, and I'm not going to make that comment.
As long as you don't get me in trouble.
I'll never hear the end of it. So we'll leave it alone. Thanks for being here, and thanks for your report. We're going to move on to our last organizational report. The U.S. Coast Guard, we have Lieutenant Commander Matt Healy with us. Lieutenant.
Hey, thanks, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. From the Coast Guard side, over the past 2 months, we've conducted about 39 fisheries enforcement boardings. Most of those have been on the HMS side of late with the bluefin tuna down North Carolina. We spent a good bit of effort down there on the enforcement side. During the past 2 months, we've had one violation issued. That was Lawrence Lawson, Colorado Cape May. They issued an enforcement action report to a commercial fishing boat that had possession of scallops inside the New York Bight scallop rotational area. We've done some marine protected species support. We had one case, 23rd of January, our station down in Hatteras rescued a cold stunned loggerhead turtle in the vicinity of the harbor marina down there, and transferred that to the rehab center. Also during that time, we've had a couple operations that we've run, and then some of them of which are ongoing. Operation Stars and Stripers, which targets fishing for Atlantic striped bass in the EEZ. We're running that until the end of February, and that ranges from North Carolina down to Virginia. So far, it's resulted in about 23 boardings. We've had 2 fishery violations to report that we've seen for stripers that were found on vessels that were fishing in the EEZ. We've also had the upright speed, which focuses on the right well speed restrictive areas. We do hail outs when we see them going through, when we observe them going through the SMAs, varying ports up the East Coast. And we've had 21 hail outs so far, violating the speed restriction for a total of 28. And those range from foreign flag boats to U.S. flag boats, sizes as well, from boats that are 65 feet or range all the way up to deep draft vessels. We've also run Operation Shucks, which is the commercial fishing vessel safety. It's on the safety side for oyster vessels that are operating in the Virginia area during the open harvest season. So we concluded that one just at the end of the month in January, and we've had 51 boardings in that fleet with 35 safety violations and 11 voyage terminations. So a lot of safety issues that we've seen there. And then just touch on the right well support for the speed op that we did with NOAA that Caleb highlighted. We also did a OpFin finder, which was down off of North Carolina enforcing the bluefin tuna regulations. That resulted in about 14 boardings and one safety violation. Then we're currently running op fish rec, which focuses on the black sea bass wave 1 seasonal opening off of Virginia on the rec side. And I also looked to James Fletcher's question on the tile fish. I looked back at some of our previous boardings. So last year we did 8 boardings where vessels were targeting tile fish on the side. And looking years past, we generally do about a handful of them on the tile fish side. So we don't do a lot of tile fish boardings, but the ones that we haven't seen any violations there. And permits is one of the things that we check. About 60% of the violations that we have on an annual basis are all related to permits. So it is something that we check. We do take it seriously. And if folks don't have a permit, we'll issue an enforcement action report and work with NOAA on the violation. On the commercial fishing vessel safety side, our examiners have issued 94 decals. They've done about 100 exams over the past 2 months. And on the search and rescue side of things, we had a few to report in the past 2 months. One, we had a collision December 1st off of Sector Delaware Bay up in Philadelphia. They had received a distress call from the fishing vessel Heather Ann with 2 people on board, stating that they were just hit and they were going down and they lost communications. Shortly thereafter, we had launched resources. They were able to restore the comms, and they reported that they were no longer taken on water, and that they weren't in distress. However, once our small boat arrived on scene, they escorted them back to Point Pleasant there in New Jersey, where they safely moored. And then the post search and rescue boarding showed that they had some damage to the mast and the port side hull there, and they think that there was a vessel collision, which our investigators are currently that investigation pens. We also had a loss of propulsion, 2 cases there, the 10 December, where Sector North Carolina, they received a call from the fishing vessel Lady Denise that was disabled about 3 miles off of Hatteras Inlet with 4 people on board. They had a broken outrigger on their starboard side. And once they arrived on, we had one of our station boats arrive on scene, and they were able to get the cable free that was preventing them from getting underway. So they were able to get them safely underway. But then there was some heavy weather rolling in the course of escorting them back to the pier there at Oregon Inlet. They had an anchor line from the fishing boat that unspooled, and it wrapped up around their propellers. And so our small boat that was on alongside, we were able to put them in tow. And as we were trying to get them through the Oregon Inlet there, we had launched the tow parted twice. It's a pretty significant weather. The boat actually drifted into some shoaling and ran aground and started in the breaking surf. So we were able to get a helo out and pull the 4 people off. And the vessel didn't pose any hazard to navigation, but the owner was working with commercial salvage to get a salvage plane out there. We also had a case 5 January where our folks in North Carolina at the sector received a call from the fishing vessel Sea Reaper. They were people on board. Another Hog Wild arrived on scene. They put them in tow, but there were some concerns about the tow line parting. So we were able to get a Coast Guard boat out there, and they relieved the tow, and were able to get them back to the Wanchese Marina with no injuries. And then lastly, we had a medevac case back in December 14th of a commercial fishing boat. The Big Ben, the master had been experiencing some stroke-like symptoms, and we requested assistance. So we were able to get a crew out there. They were to get the person off and embarked and get them to the local marina where they had. So those were the cases that we had on the search and rescue side over the past 2 months. And then on the commercial fishing vessel safety outreach front, we had folks attend the annual East Coast Commercial Fishermen's Aquaculture Trade Expo in Ocean City, Maryland last month. Then upcoming, we have the Atlantic City Boat Show at the end of the month in February that we're going to have folks go out to. And that's all I have pending any questions.
Okay, Matt, thank you for your report. Does anyone have any questions? Peter?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Matt, for the report. Scallops always piques my interest. So I'm wondering if you're at liberty to say how many pounds of scallops were on board that vessel, or whether or not that vessel was a full-time limited access vessel or a general category vessel.
So the boat that we bought, you're talking about the one that had the violation in the New York Bight area?
In the Bight.
Yeah, so the boat had, it wasn't a large quantity of scallops, but the way the regs read it, since it's a rotational area, you're not able to have scallops in the area. So it wasn't a large quantity. It looked more like personal use that they had caught, but we did issue the report, or we did issue the violation because of where they were at and, scallops being present. So I'm not sure if it doesn't seem to be part of a larger trend that we're seeing, but we do see that from time to time.
Go ahead, Peter.
Follow up, Mr. Chair, thanks. Was it a visual observation that the vessel happened to be in the same area where the Coast Guard vessel was, or was this an aerial observation or a VMS observation?
Sure, it was actually during a boarding. So we were able to get on board. We do patrols out there fairly often out in New York Bight area, Elephant Trunk, out in the 100 fathom curve. And they just happened to be on board the boat. And that's something that we tend to look for, scallops, just, because of the regs, what they say what they are. But yeah, it was during a boarding.
Rich?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Matt, were there any particular safety issues that prompted this Operation All Shucks? I'm just curious. It was interesting.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for the question. Yeah, oyster fleets that we've seen that operates up in the Virginia area there, we've historically seen a lot of safety. We've had a lot of safety issues with them in general. And it seems like the past couple of years that we've run it, safety has been a big concern where we've had to terminate several voyages on there. And this year wasn't any different, even though we've done operations such as this in the past. So it's something that, we know that it seems to be a problem there. We're going to keep focusing effort and hopefully bring the compliance rate back up. But it's definitely a part of a trend that we've been seeing over the past couple of years.
Anyone else from the council in the room here? Is there anyone online? Okay, I see Megan Lapp. Go ahead, Megan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, Lieutenant, I have a question. Have you done any outreach to the fishing community in the Mid-Atlantic area about the ongoing Coast Guard Fairways PEIS?
Yeah, thanks for the question on that one. So they work in a different shop on the waterways side, but I do know that that's something that has just been publicly released, if I'm not mistaken. I think there are some outreach efforts, but I would have to follow up with you offline to be able to get a better, accurate picture of what we're doing there.
Okay, just as a follow-up, yeah, I'd like to raise that to the council, and I do appreciate that answer. I attended last week the only in-person meeting on the whole East Coast from Maine through Virginia. It was during the New England Fisheries Management Council meeting. It was during a BOEM New York Bight PEIS meeting, and it's regarding fairways for the entire East Coast to basically allow shipping traffic and other vessel traffic to get through wind farms. It's a very, very big deal. And there are only 3 in-person meetings on the whole East Coast. The one that was held last week with like a week's notice. There's one tomorrow in Savannah, Georgia, which does not even have any wind leases on it. And then there's one next week in Norfolk, Virginia. I did make the point to the Coast Guard personnel there that, the biggest ports on the East Coast had no meetings. There was no outreach to the fishing community, and this has the potential to impact the fishing community. And I think that it might be a good idea if the council were to request more meetings, you know, in the Mid-Atlantic area, because obviously most of the offshore wind leases are in the southern New England and Mid-Atlantic area. And I would also point out that in the actual documents, there was a Regulatory Flexibility Act analysis that was conducted by the Coast Guard, like pursuant to the SBA. And they analyzed all the small businesses that would be impacted, like heating and plumbing people and machinery people and anything that could possibly be connected to offshore wind. They did not do any analysis whatsoever on all the small businesses that are commercial fishing vessels and commercial fishing businesses. And I think that that's a huge omission, which I did raise, but I think it might be good if the council raises it as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Megan, for the comments. That's something I can take back with me on our folks. I was sitting there taking some notes while you were saying that. And I know from just chatting with them, you know, the fairways, it's somewhat of a balance of trying to figure out how to, know that the wind is coming, and how do we be able to get boats in and out safely and with the deep draft traffic that's out there currently on the East Coast. So there's a balance there, but yeah, that's something I'll take back, and I appreciate your comments.
All right, thank you for that question and answer. I don't see anyone else either in the room or online at this point. So Matt, thank you for your report. Okay, before we dive into the liaison reports, I'd just like to welcome Bob Beal to the table, Executive Director of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. I thought they were bringing cookies out of the kitchen over here when you came in from the side door. Okay. Okay, so welcome, Bob. We're going to go next, before we take a break, to our liaison reports. We'll start with the New England Council's liaison report, and Peter Hughes is the Mid-Atlantic Council's liaison. So Peter, do you have a report for us?
I do. It's a brief report. It was a 2-day meeting, took place last week, January 30th and February 1st up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. There was some action that was taken, but there were a lot more updates on recent activities than there were actionable items. One of the actionable items they did was the Herring Committee. The council took action to address the current management measures to address catch of shad and river herring in the direct Atlantic herring fishery. And the council this is Amendment 10, I believe. It's they've got to develop a public hearing document. The council refined and edited the herring public hearing document to make it more user friendly. And the council then approved basically the public hearing document with their comments that they made at the council meeting, just as we had done earlier today. And the public scoping meeting notice is set to be released shortly. There was no scallop committee report. This is something that we're going to get a presentation on tomorrow, and it's the Science Center Fishery Independent Surveys. That's the white paper. There was a motion made at the council Council made this motion to task the Northeast Trawl Advisory Panel, NTAP, and NTAP Bigelow Contingency Working Group to develop an outline detailing a plan to conduct a multi-vessel IBS pilot program to test the viability of the program presented in the draft proposed plan for a novel industry-based multi-species bottom trawl survey on the Northeast U.S. continental shelf. White paper with a particular focus on refining Section 2 survey design elements and considering NEMAP protocols and current industry platform capabilities. That was a motion that was made by both the council and the ASFMC, and I think that it's important that we maybe mirror that motion tomorrow during that presentation, and I'm prepared to make that motion. The Groundfish Committee report. Groundfish recommended to GARFO recreational measures for the Gulf of Maine cod, Gulf of Maine haddock, and Georges Bank cod. council was asked to write a letter to the Northeast Fisheries Science Center requesting that the 4 cod management track assessments have a robust external peer review. These reviews are warranted given a trawl survey calibration error discovered in the Georges Bank assessment. The Dogfish Committee report, the council adopted the 2024 to 2026 dogfish specifications. Basically, the bottom line is the results of a commercial quota of 10.7 million pounds for 2024, 10.97 million pounds for 2025, and 11.22 million pounds for 2026. That concludes my report, and I would say that I believe Chris circulated this to the council, so if anybody wants to see that motion in regards to the Science Center white paper that's in there. So, any questions? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And before we get to questions, I'll turn to Eric, Chairman Reed, if there's anything you want to add, Eric, to the report.
I do not.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions for either Eric or Peter at this time? Okay, seeing none in the room. Anyone online? Okay, I don't see any hands. Peter, I'll look to you tomorrow after we get that, after we get through that portion of the agenda for a possible motion. If you'd like to make that, that would be good. Okay, thank you for your report. Okay, last, under liaison reports, we have, excuse me, the South Atlantic report. Sonny, you were at the last South Atlantic Council meeting, I believe, or do you have a report, or is Tom planning a report?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We don't have a report because we haven't had a meeting since the last meeting. We had the report, but Tom, if you have it.
Thank you, Sonny, and thank you, Chairman Luisi. Just a few items that I can bring up. As you know, I gave the liaison report at the December Philadelphia meeting. We have not met since then. Provided to you all was the agenda for our March 4th to 8th, our meeting for our Jekyll Island, excuse me, our meeting that will be held in Jekyll Island, Georgia on March 4th through 8th. There are a few items that I would point out to pay attention to. Like I mentioned in my last report, we're going to be considering potential modifications to our Southeast for Hire integrated electronic reporting program, as we're going to start looking at limited entry in that program per a motion at the last meeting. A couple other items to pay attention to, and I had this discussion with staff, is we're going to be initiating Amendment 56 on black sea bass. What's really important to note here is that our SSC will be discussing the black sea bass assessment on February 9th, which is just coming up. And this assessment is pretty poor. It shows a stock at a really depressed state due to really low recruitment. So we're expecting some really big changes. Now, obviously, this is a different stock than y'all manage here at the mid, but I think it's important to point that out. We're also going to continue looking at our private recreational permit and education requirement, which we're trying to permit all fishermen in the grouper snapper fishery, which is a big undertaking. And our law enforcement AP met last week and had a lot of feedback for us on the enforceability of that. Another issue, which I touched on at the last report as well, is we're looking at under Regulatory Amendment 36, which is going to look to allow our black sea bass pot fishery to start using on-demand ropeless gear. We took that to our law enforcement AP, and what I took from the conversation there at their meeting last week was this is a really new fishery for the South Atlantic. We don't really have many pot fisheries, so our law enforcement are really having a lot of questions about the enforceability of that. And it's also a small fishery, I believe 39 participants. In addition, just because in true South Atlantic form, I can't give a report without mentioning red snapper. On our agenda, we're going to be looking at Regulatory Amendment 35, which is one we rescinded at our previous meeting from final approval. We're going to be looking at considering modifications and additional actions. The only last thing which came from my discussion with staff was that we don't really have much to share on an Inflation Reduction Act funding at the current time because we still have projects that are looking for approval. But it is important to note that we are prioritizing things consistent with the East Coast Climate Change Scenario Planning Action Plan. So, and with that, that concludes my report.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions? Seeing none in the room. Anyone online? Okay. Tom, thank you. Sonny, thanks for that. We'll look forward to your next report at the next meeting. Okay, that concludes our business under liaison reports. I'll ask at this time, I know it's a little different. Typically, we do other business before we adjourn the meeting, but is there any other business under this business session that excuse me, that anyone would like to bring up at this time? Anyone online with any new business? Okay. James Fletcher?
I don't know whether it can come up under new business, old business, or just being aggravating. But we need to get a male dogfish fishery discussed. I don't know whether we'll find people to do it, but we've got to get it discussed. And I don't know how, when. I've asked Jason, Jason's done the best he could. But can it come up under new business that the council sets a definite date to discuss a male fishery? And thank you for your time.
Okay, James, thank you. We'll take that under consideration for another time. But I appreciate your comment. Thank you. All right, that concludes our business session. Let's take a 10-minute break. Come back at 5. Let's do more than 10 minutes. We'll come back at 2:55, and we'll get started with the rest of our agenda for the afternoon. Thanks. All right, if I can all ask everyone to start to take their seats, we're going to get started in a few minutes. All right, welcome back everyone from the break. We have two more items on today's afternoon, this afternoon's agenda. The first one is a briefing book tutorial. We're going to turn things over to Mary with the council staff to provide us the tutorial.
All right, just 1 second. I'm just sharing my screen. Okay. Hopefully you guys all have figured out a way to access the briefing materials by now. But the point of this agenda item today, which I didn't even know was going to be a full agenda item. I thought I would just pop in at some point and do things about the briefing book. But so I don't think I'm going to need 15 minutes. But I just wanted to run through a few things that might be helpful for you all to know. Some of you, actually most of you probably were not around when we were still sending out hard copy briefing books, but the whole thing would go to everybody in the mail for every council meeting, and it was very time consuming and used a lot of paper. And most people have not complained about going fully paperless. I think that was about 8 years ago, maybe 9. So when we did that, we added some new functionality to the online briefing book to make it a little bit easier to navigate. So I just wanted to run through a few of those things. So you all know the main way we get materials is on our council meeting page. And then for each agenda item, we have all the materials for that item grouped together in a briefing tab. So those are linked under each agenda item. And for some items, we have supplemental materials, which are either things that came in after the briefing book deadline or things that are more optional for review. The way that I recommend people access the briefing book is using the combined briefing book, which is linked up here at the top. And I recommend saving that to your computer and then accessing it using Adobe Acrobat or Reader. I think there's a free version of Adobe Reader, which you should all be able to download if you don't have it. But the reason I recommend using that, and I'm just going to open up the briefing book. Here we go. So it should open up with this bookmark panel on the left-hand side. And that makes it easy to jump through different parts of the book. Anything that has the little triangle on the left, to the left of the bookmark name, you can open up to expand and see all of the contents within that tab. So you can either click on the name of the bookmark to jump to that tab, or open and close the bookmark with that triangle. And I apologize to those of you who already know how to do this, but we just want to make sure that folks aren't trying to scroll through, 800-page briefing books to get where they're going. One thing that may be helpful for the people who are longing for the days of the paper briefing book, because they can write notes in it. You can still make notes in here. Your version of Acrobat may look a little bit different, but you should have a little icon that looks like a little comment box, and that will open up some other tools that you can use. You can use a highlighter to highlight text. You can add comments, and so
you know, I know not the same as having paper under your fingertips, but might be helpful for some people who want to mark up the book a little bit before the council meeting. So really those were the main things that we wanted to show you all, but I figured since we have 15 minutes, I might just open up the floor and see if there are any comments or bits of feedback on how we organize the materials. I'm always available to help or answer questions or take feedback. So yeah, with that, I'll wrap this up and would be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Does anyone have questions for Mary? Peter?
It's not a question, it's a comment. And the comment is that Mary and I had discussed a long time ago that it would be very helpful to put the presentations in here because I like to put them on my other screen and then pause while this one continues on this screen so that I can take some notes and ask some questions. But the presentations just don't magically appear. Sometimes you have to update your browser and just refresh your browser. So just a reminder, because I was looking for a presentation, and Mary's like, hit the refresh, and boom, there it was. So the presentations for me are very helpful. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Peter. Anyone else? Well, Mary, I'll say as somebody who still gets a paper copy, especially, you can take me off your list. How about that? I'll give it a shot. I'll go virtual from here on out, if that'll help you guys. One less thing to do. Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Mary. And I mean, I always download that full briefing combined. I do appreciate that you all go to the effort to actually link to the meeting page website, because sometimes when I'm fussing around online and I'm thinking, oh, we may have discussed X, Y, or Z topic at a different meeting, sometimes it's easier for me to actually just go directly to the website and, you know, find that meeting, and then I can go directly to that piece of information. So very much both ways, I guess that's what I'm saying. So thanks.
Good, that's helpful to know. Thanks.
Is there anyone online that has any questions or thoughts for the group? All right, thanks, Mary. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see. We have one more item on today's agenda, which is our last item for the day. It's a legal review, financial disclosure and recusal training, led by John Almeida. And I didn't come up with this myself, but John said if anyone had trouble falling asleep last night, to put your phone on record right now. And you can listen to this later on when you try to go to bed.
The doctors are prescribing this for insomnia.
Doctors are prescribing it, right? Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Have a point. So will I control this, Steve? Okay. All right. Good afternoon. Welcome to the 2024 GC briefing on financial disclosures and where we get new council members on board every year, and where some of the points here can get complex. I think it's a good idea to walk through this every year. In addition to the recusal information, Chris suggested that I might want to provide a brief overview for the council on what happens with these cases that are in litigation. So I'm going to walk through some of the steps in the process for the types of cases that we face when there's a challenge to a council action. So you're getting a bonus this year. Next slide. At its core, the government ethics statutes and regulations are about ensuring that public place public interest over the private gain. Taxpayers reasonably expect that public officials are not in their positions for their own private interests, and the framework that we have in place will help ensure that that happens. It's important to recognize that the federal ethics regulations are not the same as our everyday understanding of ethics, which are based on our personal moral codes. The federal ethics regulations are strict rules that everyone must follow, regardless of whether we personally believe that we can be objective in our decision making. Next slide. The statutes and regulations are very strict for federal officials when it comes to working on matters in which the official has personal financial interest. And this slide shows the default standard, which is basically you can't do it. And if you do, you could face criminal or civil penalties. This is the default standard that applies to federal officials, and council members are considered federal officials for purposes of federal ethics rules. Next slide, please. The Magnuson-Stevens Act, however, provides council members with an exception to that very strict blanket prohibition on working on matters where the official has a personal financial interest. And this is largely because in setting up the council system, Congress decided that it wanted to have people with expertise in fisheries management. And if that strict default standard applied, we likely wouldn't get that expertise. Next slide. Section 302J of Magnuson sets up the requirement that council members must disclose their financial interests and must recuse themselves from voting on matters where there would be a significant and predictable effect on their financial interests. That standard is different from the default of a few slides ago. Again, the default standard is no involvement where there's anything above a minimal financial interest. Here, the Magnuson standard allows for involvement as long as it doesn't rise above the level of significant and predictable effect. Again, Congress presumably did this in order to ensure that we have people with experience and expertise sitting at the council table working on fisheries issues, as the default standard would likely require a lot more recusals. As this slide notes, the standard applies to appointed council members, but not to NIMFs or state officials. They have a different set of ethics requirements. Next slide, please. The disclosure of financial interest is the key to the Magnuson ethics framework. Put everything out in front so members of the public can understand where council members are coming from, which fisheries they're involved in, what companies they work for, or what vessels do they own. Disclosing your involvement allows you to participate in discussions and deliberations, even in a situation where a matter would have a significant and predictable effect on the council member's interests. Next slide, please. So whose interests must be disclosed? Council members, the spouse of the council member, minor children of the council member, partners, and any organization where you serve as an officer, director, trustee, partner, or employee. In this context, partner means business partner as opposed to romantic partner. Next slide, please. As for the timing of disclosures, as you know, we need them annually by February 1st. When you join the council, it needs to happen within 45 days. But if things change during the year, we need to get the revised disclosures within 30 days, that situation changing. So if you get a new job or, buy a new boat, something like that, we need to get the revised disclosures within 30 days. And this point is because obviously things change in our lives and we need to update those within 30 days. Next slide, please. Importantly, the failure to disclose or providing false disclosures are violations of Magnuson, which can result in civil penalties, permit sanctions, even removal from the council. And in extreme situations, it could result in the provisions of Section 208 kicking in, which means civil or even criminal penalties. Next slide. There are three general categories of required disclosures. The first is the most common one that we see, and that's the ownership or employment in a company or a vessel engaged in a fishery managed by a council. The second one is employment in an organization whose members are engaged in a fishery managed by the council. And the third is ownership or employment in a company that owns or is owned by another company engaged in a fishery managed by the council. And this third category relating to indirect ownership gets to some of the more complicated situations and calculations that I'll discuss later on in this presentation. There are two other categories that don't appear on this slide. They're less common. And the first one is employment or ownership of a company that provides essential equipment, services for a fishery managed by the council. And the second situation is employment or ownership in a company that provides representational, consulting, or legal services for other companies, vessels, providing essential services or involved in the harvest, processing, marketing, lobbying, advocacy for the fishery managed by the council. So representational or consulting services. Next slide. So the information on council members' employment or ownership interests are used to determine if the thresholds are met such that there's a need for recusal from voting. Recusal means you're not participating in voting. It's not the same as abstaining. Recusal means you are pulling yourself away from the table completely. Next slide, please. So with a finding of a conflict of interest, a council chair cannot allow a conflicted member to vote. But importantly, if you are recused, you are permitted to state for the record how you would have voted. And you are permitted to participate in deliberations after you state on the record that you're recusing yourself and what the interests are that led to that recusal. Next slide, please. NOAA GC makes the recusal determinations, and we will rely on the information provided in the financial disclosures, along with other reliable and probative information. The review of recusal determinations can involve discussions with the affected individual. Next slide, please. So how does it get started? Usually it's from the request of a council member, but they can come about by NOAA GC initiating the process. Chris and I usually talk before a council meeting about what's on the agenda. Are there issues that might lead to recusal questions? And that could start the process. I would urge council members to contact me if there is a question. The more lead time, the better. And you'll see why as we get later into this presentation. Next slide, please. So when is recusal required? And you'll see the answer here, and note the bolded phrases. The Magnuson statute tells us that recusal is required when there's a council decision that would have a significant and predictable effect on the financial interest that's required to be disclosed. Next slide, please. So it's a multiple step process to answer if you answer any of these questions no, there's no need for recusal. So you walk through these steps, and if any of them get you to a no, that's the end of the process. And we'll walk through these steps in the next couple of slides. Okay, next slide, please. So the first question, is there a council decision? The regulations define what a council decision is for purposes of recusals, and it's as described in this slide. Approval of an FMP or FMP amendment, request to the regional administrator for changes to regulations, findings of emergency, and a request for emergency action, and comments on a secretarial FMP or FMP amendment. Next slide, please. Now remember the phrase from a few slides ago, a council decision with a significant and predictable effect. So the statute, there's a significant and predictable effect when there's a close causal link between the council decision and an expected and a substantially disproportionate benefit to a council member's financial interest relative to the financial interest of other participants in the fishery. Again, these two highlighted phrases are fleshed out more in the agency's regulations. Next slide, please. So a close causal link is defined as when a council decision would be reasonably expected to directly impact or affect the financial of an affected individual. The regulations tell us that where they're implementing regulations for a council decision, generally there's a presumption there of a close causal link. And where there are no implementing regulations for a council decision, there's a presumption that there's not a close causal link. The exceptions to these presumptions will hinge on the facts of the situation. Situation where there are regulations, but they're unlikely or speculative that they'll have a causal connection to someone's financial interest, then there won't be a finding of a close link. On the flip side, where there are no regulations, but despite the fact that they're not regulations, there's an expectation, non-speculative expectation that there would be a causal connection to someone's financial interest, you would find a close causal link. Next slide, please. So it can substantially disproportionate benefit is spelled out in the regulations as a positive or negative impact with regard to a council decision that's likely to affect a fishery or sector of a fishery in which the affected individual has a significant financial interest. Okay. Next slide. So what is a significant financial interest? Basically a magic number of 10%. So if a council member has greater than 10% interest in the harvest, marketing, or processing in a fishery affected by a council decision, or ownership of more than 10% of the vessels using the same type of gear in the fishery affected by the council decision, that's the threshold for a significant financial interest. Next slide. So we're going to get into attribution, and that's basically how much of the interest will be imputed on a council member. And we're going to look at 4 common situations here. The first 2 situations are pretty straightforward. The next 2 can get complicated. So direct ownership, for a council member's direct ownership in a company, percentage of ownership will be used to calculate how much interest a council member has in the fishery. So council member Bob owns 10% of a company that has a 50% interest in harvesting particular fish. Councilmember Bob will be attributed 5% of that fish. So that's below the 10% threshold. So the next situation, employment, it's full attribution. So all of a council member's employer's interest will be considered for that council member for recusal purposes. So if Councilmember Bob works for a company that has a 50% interest in harvesting a particular fish, Councilmember Bob will get all 50% attributed to him. Indirect ownership. So this is a company with ownership in another company. It's proportional. So Councilmember Bob owns 50% of a company, and that company owns 50% of a second company. Then Bob will be attributed with 25% of that second company's interest. So if that second company harvests 50% of the fish regulated by the FMP, then Councilmember Bob will get half of that, 12.5% of that fish, which is over the 10% threshold. So the next situation, parent ownership, company that owns a part of a council member's company, it's full attribution to the council member if the parent company owns 50% or more. So if Councilmember Bob's company is partially owned 50% by Councilmember Bob and by another company with 50%, with a 50% stake, then Councilmember Bob will be attributed all of that second company's interest. So if that second company harvests 10% of fish within the FMP, then Councilmember Bob will be attributed with all 10% of that company, of that harvest as well, because the other company owns 50% stake in his company. Next slide, please. Okay, this is an important point. If there isn't a specific percentage of ownership listed on your disclosures, the presumption is going to be 100% ownership. So from that previous discussion on attribution, you see why this is important, why it's important to have an accurate percentage of ownership interest, because otherwise, if If there's nothing listed, the presumption is going to be 100%. Next slide, please. All right, for employment with fishing organizations or associations, there's no attribution from other members' fishing activities, but sometimes an association itself might be engaged in fishing. And if that's the case, then the association's activity would be attributed to the council member, just like in any other employment situation. When considering the ownership interests of a spouse, partner, or minor child, we use proportional attribution as described earlier. But when you're talking about employment of a spouse, minor, or partner, that doesn't get attributed to the council member unless the compensation for that employment fluctuates based on the financial performance of the company. So if it's a straight salary or an hourly wage, that wouldn't get attributed to the council member. But if the compensation is tied to how the company does, then it is going to get attributed to the council member. Next slide, please. So, again, the importance of disclosures is that even if you're recused from voting, you can participate. You can participate in the committee process. You can participate in a lot of the process and motions leading up to a final decision on an action. You can even participate in discussions in deliberations on the vote for a final action. You just need to announce your recusal and you can participate. You can even announce how you would have voted if you weren't recused. Next slide, please. There's one last basis for recusal, and this one is pretty rare in application in the council world. And this is a situation where a council is considering a matter that's primarily of an individual concern to a council member. Then a council member has to recuse himself or herself and cannot participate in deliberations. Again, this is a rare situation, and a situation where a council is making decisions on a grant or a contract that would be awarded to a council member or a council member's employer. That would require a recusal altogether under this section of the regulations. And as far as a fishery decision, it would have to be, it would be a very unusual situation, but it would be maybe a fishery with very few participants, or an issue in a fishery that only affected a few companies, and one of those companies was owned or employed a council member, owned by or employed a council member. This recusal is sort of a higher level recusal than the normal ones that I was talking about earlier. This one, the council members can't participate in the deliberations at all. They can't, it's not like the other ones that I was describing. If you have like an actual, personalized interest in the matter, again, like a grant or a contract, you can't be, the best practice would be to leave the room, just not even be around. Next slide, please. Okay, so if you disagree with a recusal determination, you can appeal it to NOAA General Counsel. And again, the earlier you start the process, the better, because GC has 30 days to decide. And if we don't start the process until right before a council meeting, it could be too late. And as the slide notes here, a reversal of a recusal determination can't undo a council vote that's already happened. So if we think that there's an issue, the sooner we deal with it, the better. Next slide, please. When there are recusals, they're typically going to be on the record at a council meeting. But in addition to that, the agency provides an annual report with information on recusal decisions. Next slide, please. Okay, here are some resources relating to recusal issues. I'd also direct you to the Q&A document that's in the briefing book. That really lays things out pretty well. Before I turn to the next part of the presentation on litigation, does anyone have any questions they want to bring up relating to recusals?
Any questions for John on recusals? Not something you have to deal with often, as you know, John, at the Mid-Atlantic, but.
And I'm grateful.
Yeah. I think what it boils down to is if you felt a little funny listening to that presentation, you might want to have a conversation with John at some point. But yeah, I don't see any questions at this time. There's no one online. So yeah, you can continue, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, next slide, please. There we go. Okay, so next I'm going to walk through the litigation process for the cases relating to council actions. On this slide, I've listed a few recent council actions that have been challenged in court. And earlier I gave an update, and at all our meetings, I provide updates on the progress of these cases. And hopefully after this briefing, you'll have a better understanding of what's happening when I give these updates. Next slide, please. So the Magnuson-Stevens Act has specific provisions that provide for judicial review of the agency implementation of council actions. Section 305F has specific requirements for cases that are different than the typical lawsuits brought against federal agencies. First, the cases must be brought within 30 days of Federal Register publication. That's a very short limitations. The default for these types of cases outside of this Magnuson provision are typically 6 years. So 6 years versus 30 days, that's a big difference. Next, a plaintiff can't get a preliminary injunction, which is a court order that stops the agency from implementing the challenged action during the pendency of a lawsuit. This remedy is just not available in Magnuson cases. And that, is different than the typical lawsuit against the government. And importantly, for how these cases play out, the Magnuson provisions are very clear that the standard of review for the courts is found in the Administrative Procedure Act. Next slide, please. So the Administrative Procedure Act, or the APA, provides what's known as the arbitrary and capricious standard of review. What that means is courts, when they're reviewing an agency action, should only overturn an agency decision if they find it to reach the level of arbitrary and capricious, which on its face is a pretty favorable standard of review for the agency. In making its finding in an APA case, an APA type case, the court looks at what was in the record before the agency when it's made its decision to make that finding. Was the agency action arbitrary and capricious? And the record before the agency when it's made its decision is the administrative record. You'll hear me talk about that a lot in my updates, the administrative record. Next slide, please. So these APA concepts are very important as to how these cases play out. Basically, by reviewing the administrative record, all the facts for the court are contained in the documents in the record. So that being the case, there's no fact finding being done by the court, which in litigation typically happens through the testimony of witnesses. Likewise, a trial is the way that the court typically determines facts in a case. But if all the facts are contained in a record, then there's no need for a trial. So instead, these record review cases are decided on motions, which are written filings by the parties, and most often on motions for summary judgment. You'll hear me refer to motions for summary judgment law in my updates. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to walk through the steps in a typical case, and it starts with the complaint. This is the first document that's filed in a case by the plaintiff, and it's referred to, pleadings are kind of remnants of the old school of law where courts had rigid requirements on certain types of papers and forms of papers that would be filed. And it was a very formalistic approach where if you didn't, use the right pleading and the right, sequence of pleading, it could be over. It was a very hyper-technical approach to the law. The modern system has largely done away with this formalistic approach, but the complaint is one of those remnants from that earlier time. And the complaint is basically an overview of the case that the plaintiffs are bringing. And it lays out, first why the court has jurisdiction over the matter, and it puts in general terms what the facts of the law are to support their claims. It's laid out in numbered paragraphs. Some complaints can be hundreds of paragraphs long, and a complaint has to be served on when there's a lawsuit against a federal agency. It needs to be served on the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Department of Justice in D.C., and on the agency. So it needs to be served on 3 different entities within the government. Next slide, please. So once a complaint is served by the plaintiff, then the defendant would file an answer to the complaint, which again, this is one of the few remaining kind of pleadings in modern litigation. Under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, the answer needs to be filed within 45 days of service. And what the answer does is it goes through those numbered paragraphs, paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence, sometimes clauses within sentence, and it admits or denies the allegations that are in those numbered paragraphs. The answer should also contain affirmative defenses that the defendants might want to argue later in the case. An affirmative defense based on things like jurisdiction, statute of limitations, or other defenses that don't go to the merits of the case itself. Next slide, please. Sometimes, rather than filing an answer, a defendant can file a motion to dismiss, typically based on jurisdictional arguments, or sometimes what's described as a failure to state a claim upon which relief can be granted. So an example of a failure to state a claim argument, if people remember the anglers litigation relating to river herring and shad, there were several lawsuits filed over a couple of years. The first case, the first anglers case, sued NIMFS over a Mid-Atlantic Council vote not to pursue an amendment. NIMFS filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the plaintiffs had failed to state a claim for which relief could be granted because the case was attempting to challenge a council decision, not an action by NIMFS. And the court agreed with that argument. So that case never got beyond the motion to dismiss. Next slide, please. So if we have a case where there aren't jurisdictional arguments and we file an answer, then we need to get the administrative record together for the court as well. One unusual requirement of Magnuson is that NIMFS is supposed to get the administrative record together and served at the same time as an answer. That's not the case for most APA litigation. Typically, the answer gets filed in the record at some point later in time. Now, sometimes the record can be so big or complex that the agency will ask for additional time beyond those 45 days, but the provisions of the statute do have the answer and the record getting filed at the same time. Again, the administrative record is going to serve as the basis for the court's review. So it should contain the documents that were before the agency at the time it made its decision. Next slide, please. So what goes into the administrative record? From the council side of things, a lot of the materials we have in the briefing books at council meetings, a lot of those documents are going to end up in the administrative record. And you'll have, committee memos, you'll have a lot of the council materials that we see at our briefing books. And then you're going to end up with the documents that are created by NIMFS and council staff together. So like the or the NEPA documents. And then the documents that are created by NIMFS. So like the ESA or register notices. And then within the NIMFS decision-making process, memos between going up to decision makers. And you're also going to include comments from the public, both during the council process and during the NIMFS rulemaking process. Next slide, please. So when the agency pulls the administrative record together, sometimes there's going to be disputes over whether more items should be added. A plaintiff might want to add a document that they think should be included. It could be an oversight, or sometimes it could be something that NIMS would oppose, because from NIMS perspective, it was never actually part of the council or the agency's record, so it wasn't really before the decision maker. So you might have a dispute over where the record begins. As you know, sometimes council actions can rattle around for years before they get on track to, formally starting an amendment or a framework. And, sometimes you can have actions that start out as a piece of a bigger action, they get dropped out of that, only then start on their own process later in time. So for situations like that, you might have a dispute over where the record begins. And was it at the outset of that earlier action, or in the middle of the earlier action, or at the beginning of the new action? Sometimes you might have a dispute over a document cross-references another document, and that reference to that document, there might be an argument that should be included in the record, but it wasn't. A lot of times these disagreements are negotiated between the sides, but sometimes you might have a motion that goes before the court, and the court ends up making the decision whether those documents are in or whether those documents are out. Next slide, please. Okay, once you've got the record nailed down, then the case is ready for the parties to make their case on the merits. As I said earlier, this is typically done through motions for summary judgment. Summary judgment is the way courts decide cases in which there's no dispute over the relevant facts. So the court doesn't need to do fact finding in the form of a trial. And as I said earlier, that's the posture of these record review cases. The facts are all contained in the administrative record. So summary judgment is the way to get to which side wins. Typically, the parties set up a briefing schedule where they stagger their briefs. So the plaintiffs will go first, like the way this is laid out. The plaintiffs will go first, and then the defendants will file their cross motion for summary judgment combined with the opposition to the plaintiff's motion for summary judgment. Then the plaintiffs will go, they'll file their opposition to the government's motion for summary judgment, combined with a reply in support of their motion for summary judgment. And usually the government gets the last word by filing a reply brief in support of its motion for summary judgment. So the briefs that get filed are basically long arguments as to why each side believes they're entitled to judgment. And they typically cite to case law, statutes, regulations, and various documents in the administrative record. In some cases, the court will want to hear from the lawyers so that the judge can ask questions directly. And in those cases, the court will schedule oral arguments on the motions. It seems in recent years that the trend, at least that I've seen, is fewer courts are setting up oral argument. They're just deciding on the papers more often than I seem to recall earlier in my career. Next slide, please. So after everything's briefed, it's time for the court to make its decision. And usually the court will provide a written opinion that lays out why it's ruling the way it did. And it'll typically address the arguments from the parties and why the court agrees or disagrees with each side's arguments. The written opinion is very important, both for giving us an understanding of what the law is and requires of us, but also in the case itself, that serves as the basis for an appeal to a higher court. So judges who write these opinions know that, and they're going to be very careful. Sometimes they'll take a long time making the decisions and writing out how and why they're ruling the way they are, because they know that they could be under the microscope of an appellate court. Next slide, please. So in this last slide, I lay out the general timelines to expect in these kind of lawsuits. As you can see, it's not something that gets resolved overnight, but compared to other types of lawsuits where a case builds up to a trial, these cases actually can be a lot quicker in comparison. So the last step, the decision from the court, that's up to the court. And we really, courts operate at their own pace and their own schedule, and we can't really do anything to divine when they're going to rule or encourage them to rule in a certain time frame. It's really like the black box. It goes in and they come up with their answer in the time frame that they typically that works for that judge. But I gave typically we get a decision in less than a year, but it can be a lot less than a year, or it could even be longer than a year. So, but these other time frames are, typically what we're looking at in these kinds of cases. The one point here where it's resolving disputes over the record, it could be 0 days up to a year. The up to a year piece is if we have to file a motion with the court, then it's out of our hands. And again, the court can decide when the court wants to decide. So I hope this presentation helps people understand a little better the process that unfolds when a council action gets challenged in court. Obviously, we all have a stake in these cases, so I think it's important that I keep updating you on what's happening in the cases. And to the extent you have questions about the process, I'm here to answer questions if you have them today or in the future or during my GC updates. Feel free to ask, or even reach out between meetings. Feel free to reach out to me. But if anyone has any questions now, I'd be happy to try to answer.
Yeah, thanks, John. I appreciate the presentation. It always makes me very thankful when I hear reports like this to have you, to know that you're here to help us, because this gets really complicated really fast, and it's always a good to get the refresher. Dr. Duvall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the presentation, John. We appreciate it, even though sometimes it seems like he who can file the most documents wins, and or the most megabytes or whatever it may be. I assume these are all electronic. I guess my question is, how frequently you have cases in which there's actually a dispute over the record, given that most of these are, primarily based on council documents, which are, almost all public record?
I'd say in just about every case, there's going to be a dispute. Some of those disputes are easily resolved, though, so they're not really that challenging of a dispute. The ones that you have kind of coming to blows, leading to motions, that's not, I'd say, less than a third. We end up filing motions about records, at least the cases that I've dealt with.
Follow-up. So is it most of these disputes are just like somebody actually just inadvertently overlooked some document that should have been part of the record or something like that?
Sometimes that happens, or sometimes there's a principled basis for it, but it's not worth fighting about. Sometimes, it all depends. But, a lot of time, again, I think like the most complicated ones that are you're not necessarily going to fight over them are like the action that arose from some other action. And then, okay, we're drawing the line here, at this point in time, like when the council decided to take up framework X and that meetings going forward. In that situation where framework X was peeled off of some other action 2 years before, those kinds of things, it's like, okay, I can understand why some of that document, then it becomes like is it all, is it some, is it a few, but those discussions typically can be fruitful, presuming both sides are agreeable to discussing them. That help? Okay.
Any other questions for John? Eric Reed.
Mr. Chair. As far as the administrative record goes, what for a final action, which is what I would Garpo's final action, what part does the council discussion play in the administrative record?
Yeah, that's interesting because In the past, ancient past, I think this council used to have transcripts of council meetings, but that's no longer the case. We have recordings of the council meetings. So sometimes you'll have situations where folks will want to cite to discussion, and then there might be a dispute, because we're not not including in the record all the recordings of the meetings. But you might have a fight over, well, it happened, it was before the decision maker. We want to be able to cite to that recording. And depending on the circumstances, that might be a concession that's made, or it might be a fight, So there's no sort of universal answer to that question. I think if it's a transcript, that's a much easier, probably be a lot more amenable to including those in the record, as opposed to the recordings, which we're typically not including those in the record.
Sonny Gwen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is on the timing. Why would it take up to a year for a decision?
I'm not a judge. I couldn't tell you. I mean, judges have a lot on their plates, right? And what we think is super important, the court might have a criminal matter that's much more pressing in their mind, in terms of prioritizing what they're going to work on in a given time frame. And the other piece of it is, some of these cases are complicated, and the judge might have to learn a lot in order to be able to write in a good opinion. So I think sometimes you have courts where the judge is getting up to speed so that they're able to make a decision. And as you know, trying to teach yourself something, that takes time.
Sonny knows all too well with his shrimp fishery that he was trying to teach himself this year. Any other questions for John? Joe Semino.
Thanks, John. I'm curious how often a third or fourth party comes in and just kind of where that, how does that work exactly? I think with the harvest control rule, we have a situation like that.
Yeah, it's not unusual, because if you have a case, it's called intervention, right? So someone would intervene on typically on the government side, right? So we're being sued by one side. An intervener would come try and help us defend the case. And it could be the dynamics, you could have an NGO suing and then industry, or in the harvest control rule, the rec industry, the rec organization coming in as a defendant intervener. But it could be flipped. It could be industry suing and NGO joining to be an intervener. And it's not unusual at all. I would say it's pretty common in these cases to have intervention.
Okay, anyone else? Is there anyone online that has any questions they'd like to ask John? Okay, seeing none. John, again, thanks for the presentation. Well, that concludes our business to come before the council today. I looked at the agenda for tomorrow, and there just isn't anything that we can take on to round out the day to get us through any of tomorrow's agenda based on presentations and presenters and timing and such. So I'm going to turn things over at this point to Chris, who would like to make an announcement on hospitality.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We will have hospitality tonight. Everyone's invited. We'll start right after the meeting. It's in room 1516, 1516. If you're not in this hotel, you do need a key to get up to the 15th floor. So find a buddy with a key. Come up to hospitality. Room is 1516.